My coworker set me up on a fishing boat with a stranger. I didn't expect her to be right about him until the night I heard his voice over my emergency radio. Holly was 29, a county 911 dispatcher working rotating 12-hour shifts that bounced her between days and overnights every 2 weeks. A job that paid decent for the area, but never left her with the kind of predictable schedule most people took for granted. The kind where you could actually plan a Saturday without checking a rotation calendar first. She'd taken the job 6 years back, straight out of the community college's emergency communications program. And most people who met her outside of work never guessed what she did for a living until she mentioned it, because dispatchers didn't look like anything in particular. They just sounded a certain way once you trained your voice to stay level, while somebody screamed into the other end of a call. Dean Foss was 33, owner of a 2-truck towing and recovery outfit he'd built up from one used flatbed he'd bought at auction 8 years ago with money he didn't fully have at the time. And these days he ran calls at every hour the county needed him. Wrecks, breakdowns, the occasional repossession job he didn't love, but paid the bills during slow stretches. The business turned a real profit most months, enough to keep both trucks insured and both his part-time drivers on payroll. But between equipment maintenance, fuel costs, and the insurance premiums that came with hauling other people's wrecked vehicles off the highway, Dean hadn't taken an actual day off in longer than he could comfortably admit to anybody who asked. Wanda Pruitt worked the dispatch desk 2 seats down from Holly most weeks, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who ran weekend charter fishing trips out of the marina on her days off to supplement a county salary that never quite covered what she wanted it to. And she'd towed with Dean's company enough times over the years, her own truck having a habit of dying at the worst possible moments, that she knew exactly the kind of steady, unbothered guy he was. She'd mentioned Holly to Dean exactly once, offhand, weeks earlier, while he was hooking up her stalled pickup on the shoulder of Route 9. And something about the way he'd asked a follow-up question instead of just nodding along had stuck with her long enough that when a Saturday charter opened up with 2 empty seats, she filled them both without telling either person the other one was booked. Wanda said this was a full boat, Holly said, standing on the dock in the gray early light, looking between the empty parking lot and the one stranger loading a cooler onto the deck. You seeing anybody else showing up, or is it just us? Just us, looks like, Dean said, glancing up from the cooler, with the particular expression of a man doing quick math in his head and not loving the answer. She tell you it was a group trip? She told me it was a slow Saturday and I should get out of the apartment, Holly said, arms crossed against the morning chill coming off the water. Didn't mention a head count. Wanda appeared from the wheelhouse at that exact moment, sunglasses already on despite the early hour, radiating the kind of unbothered confidence of somebody who knew exactly what she'd done and had zero intention of apologizing for it. Morning, kids. Tide's good. Fish are biting, and I've got a boat that needs 2 paying customers to make the fuel worth it. Y'all know each other? We do now, Dean said, dry, not quite looking at Holly, but clearly aware of her standing 3 feet away. Wanda, Holly said, voice flat in the specific way dispatchers get when they already know exactly what's happening and want it on record anyway. Did you set us up? I set up a fishing charter, Wanda said, already turning back toward the wheelhouse. What you two do with 6 hours on open water is entirely your own business. Life jackets are under the bench. We shove off in 10. Neither of them argued, mostly because arguing with Wanda had never once worked for anybody in dispatch history. And there wasn't exactly a bus back to town from the marina at 6 in the morning anyway. So Holly climbed aboard, set her own bag down on the bench across from Dean's cooler, and decided the day was what it was going to be, regardless of how it started. The boat cleared the breakwater around 6:15, engines settling into a steady low growl, as Wanda pushed them out past the buoy line into open water, and Dean got to work rigging 2 lines off the stern without being asked, threading fresh-cut bait onto circle hooks with the kind of unhurried competence that told Holly he'd done this plenty of times before, tying a leader knot she recognized from her own childhood summers on her father's boat, a uni-to-uni splice that held better under strain than the cheap swivel connections most weekend anglers relied on. You tie a decent knot for a tow truck guy, Holly said, watching him work. Grew up on my uncle's charter boat down in Beaufort before I ever touched a flatbed, Dean said, not looking up from the hook he was setting. Figured towing paid better and broke my back less, but the knots stuck around. I grew up fishing too, Holly said, settling onto the bench beside the second rod. My dad ran a little 16-footer, mostly weekend stuff. Taught me to read a fish finder before I could parallel park. She reached over without asking and adjusted the sonar display Wanda had left dialed to the wrong depth range, tapping the screen until the readout resolved into a cleaner picture of the structure below them, a shelf dropping off into deeper water about 40 yards out. There, bait fish stacked up right along that ledge. Whatever's feeding on them is going to be sitting just underneath. Dean glanced at the screen, then at her, something shifting in his expression that looked a lot like reassessment. Didn't figure a dispatcher for knowing sonar readouts that well. Didn't figure a tow truck guy for knowing a proper uni knot, Holly said, matching his tone exactly. Guess we're both full of surprises before 7 in the morning. They set the downrigger to hold bait at the depth Holly had called, the release clip clicking shut with a small metallic snap that meant the line would stay pinned at 18 feet until a strike popped it free. A rig Holly explained without being asked. Since Wanda's gear was older than the equipment she'd grown up running, and the release tension needed adjusting by hand rather than a dial, the kind of small mechanical knowledge that came from actually working a boat instead of just riding on one, and settled into the particular quiet that comes from two people waiting on fish, neither one feeling obligated to fill every silence with conversation. Holly noticed, without saying anything about it, that Dean checked the bait on both lines every 15 minutes or so without being asked, a habit that read less like nervous fidgeting and more like the same kind of automatic diligence she saw in the best dispatchers on her shift, the ones who double-checked a unit's location on the map, even when the call seemed routine, because routine was exactly when people got sloppy. Wanda kept the boat idling in a slow, deliberate drift along the ledge, occasionally calling back adjustments from the wheelhouse. And for the first hour, neither Holly nor Dean talked about much beyond the water, the weather holding clear, the particular shade of green the current turned where it met the drop-off. It was Dean who broke the quiet first, somewhere around the second hour, watching Holly rebait a hook after a small fish had stripped it clean. You always work the overnight shifts, or does that rotate? Rotates every 2 weeks, Holly said. 2 weeks of days, 2 weeks of nights, over and over. Messes with sleep worse than anybody warns you about going in. I get that, Dean said. Tow calls don't care what time it is either. Guy slides off the road at 3 in the morning in an ice storm. That's not a call I get to push to business hours. How do you even sleep with a schedule like that? Holly asked. Badly, Dean said, and something dry and honest in the way he said it made her laugh for real, the first unguarded sound either of them had made all morning. Coffee mostly, and knowing the next call could be anything from a flat tire to somebody's whole week going sideways, so you learn to switch on fast whether you slept or not. That's basically my job too, Holly said, except my switch has to happen before the truck's even moving. Somebody calls in screaming, and my voice has to stay level enough that they can actually hear the instructions I'm giving them instead of just the panic underneath it. That sounds harder than anything I do, Dean said, and it didn't come out like flattery, just a flat assessment from a guy who dealt in mechanical problems most days and clearly respected a job that dealt in something less fixable. Around 11, the rod on Dean's side of the boat bent hard and sudden, the reels dragged, screaming out line fast enough that both of them were on their feet before Wanda had even called it from the wheelhouse. Dean grabbed the rod, working the fish with steady practice pumps, and Holly moved to the gunnel beside him without being asked, net already in hand, calling out the fish's movement as it surfaced twice, dove again, ran a tight circle under the hull. He's going under the boat, Holly said, watching the line angle sharply. Keep the tip up. Don't let him saw it against the hull. Dean adjusted without argument, trusting her read on it the same easy way she'd trusted his not work earlier. And 3 minutes later, a solid striped base came thrashing up alongside the boat, and Holly scooped it clean into the net on the first pass, hauling it aboard while Dean laughed, genuinely, wiping sweat off his forehead despite the cool morning air. Good team, Wanda called down from the wheelhouse, not even bothering to hide the satisfaction in her voice. Didn't even have to coach you two through that one. By the time the boat turned back toward the marina in the late afternoon, the cooler between them held 4 decent fish. Sunburn was setting into the back of both their necks, and neither Holly nor Dean had checked a phone once in 6 hours, which for two people whose jobs revolved entirely around being reachable, felt like its own small miracle. They stood at the dock afterward while Wanda hosed down the deck, splitting the catch into two coolers, and Dean handed Holly her share along with something else. A folded receipt from the bait shop with a phone number written on the back in pen that had clearly needed a few tries to get the ink flowing. In case you want to compare notes sometime, Dean said, on whose job actually has the worst schedule. I'm pretty sure mine wins, Holly said, taking the receipt anyway and tucking it into her jacket pocket. But I'll need more data before I make it official. Dean nodded, hefting his cooler onto one shoulder, and glanced back once before heading toward his truck in the gravel lot, the evening light catching the salt spray still drying on his forearms. Guess I'll call you sometime this week then. Purely for research purposes. Purely for research, Holly agreed, watching him go, and stood there a minute longer than she needed to, salt stiff and sunburned, and for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, not thinking about the rotation calendar waiting for her back at the apartment. 6 weeks into whatever this had turned into, Holly Bergen had learned to recognize the specific rhythm of Dean Foss's schedule, well enough to know that a canceled dinner wasn't a red flag. It was just Tuesday, and neither of them had bothered pretending otherwise since the day they realized their jobs ran on the exact same unpredictable clock. What started as two people comparing notes on bad schedules turned into the night. Holly sat behind a dispatch console listening to the worst hour of Dean's year unfold over a radio channel. She couldn't do anything but manage, and it changed something between them that no amount of research, purely for scheduling purposes, ever fully put back the way it was. The 6 weeks in between had built themselves out of the same small, practical exchanges that started on the boat. Nothing dramatic, just two people fitting into the cracks of each other's rotating shifts. Dean would swing by the dispatch center's parking lot with a coffee when his last tow of the night happened to end near her shift change, and Holly started keeping a spare charging cable in her car, specifically because his phone died mid-call more often than any grown man's phone should. Small, unremarkable habits that neither of them had officially agreed to, but both of them kept doing anyway. Some weeks they managed one real dinner together. Other weeks it was a 20-minute overlap in a parking lot between her shift change and his last call of the day. And neither of them treated the thin stretches as a problem, mostly because both of them had spent years dating people who couldn't understand a schedule like theirs, and something about finally being with somebody who simply nodded and said, "That's rough," instead of getting offended by a canceled plan, felt like its own kind of relief. Neither one wanted to name too loudly in case naming it jinxed it. The real work between them, though, had started with Dean's radio problem. His company held the county's on-call contract for highway recovery, which meant his trucks answered whenever county dispatch needed a wreck cleared or a disabled vehicle pulled off the shoulder. But his communication with the dispatch center had always run rough around the edges. Drivers stepping on each other's transmissions, unclear ETAs. The kind of sloppy radio discipline that worked fine on a slow Tuesday and turned into a real problem the one night it mattered. Holly had noticed it from her side of the console for months before she ever met him in person. Foss Towing's calls always a little messier than the other contracted companies. And one evening, over gas station coffee in his truck cab, she finally said something about it. "Your guys don't use proper call and acknowledge," Holly told him, turning his handheld radio over in her hands, studying the worn label on the channel selector. "Somebody keys up, gives an update, and just starts driving without waiting to hear dispatch confirm they copied it. Half the time we're re-asking for ET as you already gave us, which slows everybody down." "Didn't realize that was a thing with an actual name," Dean admitted, watching her work the radio like it was something she'd handled 1,000 times, which, functionally, she had. "We just kind of talk on it." "That's the problem," Holly said, not unkindly, more the flat, practical correction of somebody who'd spent 6 years training rookies out of exactly this habit. "You need a clean handoff. Unit identifies, gives the update, ends with over, dispatch reads it back, confirms, then you're clear to move. Adds maybe 4 seconds a call, saves you from getting sent to the wrong mile marker during an actual emergency." She spent the better part of that evening walking him through it, drilling the format with him over the truck's dashboard radio until his responses came out clean and automatic. And by the following week, his drivers were running calls tight enough that another dispatcher 2 seats down from Holly asked, without knowing the backstory, what had gotten into Foss towing all of a sudden. Dean paid it back a different way a few days later, noticing without being asked that Holly's sedan had developed a low-grinding whine every time she braked coming into the dispatch center's lot. And instead of making a production out of it, he just pulled her brake pads and rotors one afternoon in his own shop bay while she sat on an overturned bucket eating a sandwich, handing him tools when he asked for them, and not once suggesting she couldn't have gotten it done herself if she'd had the lift. "You didn't have to do the whole job," Holly said, watching him torque the caliper bolts back down. "Pads were down to the wear indicator," Dean said, not looking up. "Another week, and you'd have been grinding rotor on rotor. Wasn't going to let you drive that into a 12-hour shift." "Still counts as you doing something you didn't have to," Holly said. "So does teaching my whole crew proper radio discipline for free," Dean said, finally glancing up with something dry in his expression. "Guess we're both bad at staying out of each other's business." The ice storm hit on a Thursday in late January, the kind of storm the local weather service had been warning about for 2 days straight, freezing rain layering over asphalt that hadn't fully cleared from the last cold snap. And Holly had pulled a double that week specifically because 2 other dispatchers had called out sick, which meant she was sitting console when the first call came in a little after 9 at night. A 5-vehicle pileup on the overpass where Route 9 crossed the interstate, cars sliding through the intersection one after another as the ice caught tires that had no business still being out on the road. She worked the call the way she worked every call, voice level, pulling up the county's contracted recovery list. And when she saw Foss towing next in rotation for the scene, her hand hesitated half a second on the keyboard before she pushed through and kept her voice from showing it, because a dispatcher who let personal stakes bleed into her radio traffic wasn't doing her job, and 5 vehicles worth of people trapped on an icy overpass needed her doing her job more than they needed her feelings about it. "Foss towing, you're up for the overpass recovery," Holly said into her headset, reading the address, the number of vehicles, the road conditions off her screen exactly like she would for any other call. "Be advised, roads still actively icing, additional units responding for traffic control." Dean's voice came back through the radio a few seconds later, steady, professional, the same clean call and acknowledge format she'd drilled into him weeks earlier. "Foss towing copies, en route with 2 trucks, ETA 12 minutes. A pause just half a second longer than his usual rhythm, the only sign that he'd clocked her voice on the other end of the channel before switching fully back into work mode. "Dispatch, be advised we'll need extra light on scene. That overpass has no shoulder lighting." "Copy that, Foss," additional lighting noted, Holly said, and made herself keep working the rest of the board, coordinating the ambulance units, the state troopers setting up the traffic brake, the second wrecker company covering a separate fender bender across town, while some part of her stayed locked onto the channel Dean's trucks were working. The next 40 minutes crawled by in the particular way emergencies did from behind a dispatch console, everything happening somewhere she couldn't see, filtered through radio chatter and GPS pings on a screen. Dean's voice checking in periodically with updates on the recovery, a sedan wedged against the guardrail needing a winch pull, a second vehicle with a driver still trapped until fire and rescue could extract them safely. Holly logged it all, coordinated it all, kept her voice exactly as level as she had 1,000 times before, on 1,000 other calls that didn't have anybody in them she actually cared about. It was 9:52 when the radio traffic changed, Dean's voice cutting through sharper and faster than his usual rhythm, dropping the call and acknowledge formatting entirely. "Dispatch, we've got a man down on scene. Repeat, man down. My driver Cody Reyes was clear of the recovery vehicle when a car lost control coming through the traffic brake struck him. He's conscious but not moving his left leg. Need medical redirected to our position now." Holly's hands moved before her brain fully caught up, already keying the ambulance unit already staged nearby, already updating the state trooper's channel. Every motion drilled into muscle memory from 6 years of exactly this kind of moment, And it was only in the 4 or 5 seconds it took the ambulance to confirm they were rolling that she let herself register what Dean had actually said, that a man on his crew was down, hit by a car on an ice sheet 20 feet from where Dean himself had been standing not 60 seconds earlier. "Ambulance is 2 minutes out, Foss," Holly said, and her voice held, professional, level, the way it had to, even though every other part of her wanted to ask if Dean himself was okay instead of just relaying the next logistical step. "Keep him warm. Keep him still. Don't let him try to stand." "Copy," Dean said, clipped. And then nothing else came through the channel for the next 90 seconds. 90 seconds that felt considerably longer than that to Holly, sitting behind a console 2 miles away, with absolutely no way to do anything except manage the response unfolding without her. Cody made it to the hospital with a broken tibia and a dislocated shoulder, serious, painful, but not the kind of injury that ended a life. And by the time Dean finally called Holly's cell at nearly midnight instead of coming through the dispatch channel, his voice had dropped the clipped professional edge and gone rough around the corners, in a way she'd never heard from him before. "He's stable," Dean said before she could even ask. "Surgery in the morning for the shoulder, legs set and casted. Scared the hell out of both of us, but he's going to be okay." "I heard the whole thing," Holly said, sitting in her car in the dispatch center's parking lot. Engine running for the heat, hands still faintly unsteady from 6 hours of holding a professional voice through the worst call of her month. "Every second of it, over the radio, and I couldn't do anything except tell you to keep him warm." "You got the ambulance there in 2 minutes, Dean said. "That's not nothing, Holly." "I know it's not nothing," Holly said, and something in her own voice cracked open in a way she hadn't planned on letting happen. "But I sat there listening to you say man down, and I couldn't leave my console. Couldn't ask if you were the one who got hit. Had to just keep working the board like it was any other call, and I don't know how to explain what that did to me." Dean was quiet for a second on the other end. "I'm okay. I was 10 feet clear when it happened." "This time," Holly said, quieter now. "You do this every single week, Dean. Ice, 3 in the morning, drunk drivers coming through work zones. And I love my job, I do. But my job means I listen to people's worst nights for a living, and I don't know if I can do that, and also love someone whose worst night is a real possibility every single shift he works." "So what are you saying?" Dean asked, careful, like he already knew the shape of the answer and didn't want to hear it said out loud. "I don't know yet," Holly admitted. "I need some time to figure out if I can actually carry this, or if I'm about to spend every one of your work nights sitting exactly where I sat tonight, scared out of my mind and pretending I'm not." She rubbed a hand over her face, the parking lot lights blurring slightly through the windshield. "I'm not ending anything, Dean. I just need to not pretend tonight didn't happen." "Take whatever time you need," Dean said, and there was no argument in it, just the same steady, unhurried tone he used working a bad scene. Like he understood this was its own kind of recovery job, and rushing it would only make the whole thing worse. "I'll be around. Same schedule as always, for better or worse." Holly hung up, sat in her car another few minutes with the heater running and the radio silent for the first time in 6 hours, and drove home through streets still slick with the last of the ice, thinking about a broken tibia and 2 minutes that had felt like 20, and wondering whether loving somebody whose job looked exactly like her own worst calls was a kind of bravery she actually had in her, or just a kind of fear she wasn't ready to carry yet. 11 days after the ice storm, Holly Bergen was working a quiet Tuesday overnight shift when a call came across her board so ordinary it almost slipped past her without registering: a dead battery in a grocery store parking lot. Routine enough that she barely looked at which company got dispatched, and it was the sound of Dean Foss's voice coming through the radio a few minutes later, calm and unhurried, over something as small as a jumpstart, that ended up doing more to fix what the ice storm had broken than any conversation either of them had planned on having. What started as 11 days of careful distance turned into the night Holly finally understood the difference between the job that scared her and the man who did it. Dean hadn't pushed during those 11 days, hadn't called more than once to check in, hadn't shown up outside the dispatch center, hoping to catch her on a break, because he'd meant what he said in the parking lot the night of the storm, that she could take whatever time she needed, and pushing past that would have just proven her fear right instead of easing it. He kept working his route, kept his crew running the clean radio discipline she taught them, and twice that week he drove out to the hospital after his shift ended to sit with Cody Reyes, bringing him fast food the hospital cafeteria couldn't compete with, and helping him figure out short-term disability paperwork with the same patient, unhurried focus he brought to a bad recovery scene. Cody's surgery had gone clean, the shoulder pinned and healing on schedule, the tibia set with a rod that would keep him off the trucks for at least 10 weeks. And Dean had already told him his job would be waiting whenever a doctor cleared him. No pressure, full pay continuation through the company's workers' comp policy in the meantime. The kind of promise Dean took seriously enough that he'd spend an uncomfortable afternoon on the phone with his insurance broker, making sure the coverage actually held up the way his policy claimed it would. He didn't mention any of that to Holly directly during those 11 days, not out of strategy, just because it didn't occur to him that sitting with an injured employee's paperwork counted as the kind of thing a woman needed to hear about to trust him again. He just did it because it was the next right thing in front of him, the same way he'd have chalked a wheel or checked a mirror without stopping to think it might be observed. Holly, for her part, hadn't spent those 11 days deciding to walk away. She'd spent them doing something closer to reverse engineering her own fear, running dispatch calls the way she always had, noticing for the first time in months just how many of them were exactly what they should be. Routine, boring, resolved in 20 minutes with nobody hurt, and realizing somewhere around day 6 that she'd let one terrible night convince her the job was nothing but terrible nights, when the actual math of it ran overwhelmingly the other direction. She'd even pulled the county's own incident logs on her lunch break one day, scrolling back through 6 months of Foss Towing's dispatch calls out of a mix of curiosity and something closer to needing proof, and the numbers held up exactly the way she suspected they would. One serious incident against a couple hundred routine recoveries, jump starts, and lockouts. A ratio that looked a lot less frightening laid out in a spreadsheet than it had sounded replaying in her memory at 2 in the morning. The Tuesday night call came in at 11:40, a woman locked out of her sedan in the grocery store lot with a toddler's car seat visible through the window and groceries going warm in the trunk. Nothing dangerous about it, no ice, no highway, no traffic, break to manage. Just an ordinary inconvenience that needed an ordinary fix. Holly dispatched it on autopilot, checked the rotation, saw Foss Towing next up, and felt something in her chest that wasn't fear this time. Just a familiar, steady kind of attention. Foss Towing, you're up. Lockout at the Harrison Street Kroger. Customer's got a toddler seat in the back. No immediate danger, just wants back in her car, Holly said into her headset. Foss copies, en route, ETA 8 minutes, Dean's voice came back, and something in the plain, unhurried way he said it. No urgency, no edge. The exact same voice he used on a Tuesday grocery store lockout, as he'd used discussing the weather on a fishing boat, settled something in Holly that 11 days of thinking hadn't managed to settle on its own. She listened to the rest of the call unfold the way she'd listened to hundreds of calls before it. Dean's voice checking in on scene, working an airbag wedge and long-reach tool through the door gap with the kind of patient, practiced motion that had nothing dramatic about it at all. Popping the lock in under 2 minutes, the customer thanking him audibly enough that Holly could hear it bleeding through his open mic before he keyed off. Foss Towing clear, lockout resolved, customers back in her vehicle, no further units needed. Copy, Foss clear, Holly said, and sat there a moment after logging the call closed, running the numbers in her head the way she should have done 11 days earlier, instead of just replaying the worst 4 minutes of the year on a loop. Hundreds of calls a month between his 2 trucks, the vast majority of them exactly like this one. Mechanical, mundane, over before anybody's heart rate had a real reason to climb. And one bad night on an ice sheet didn't erase all the ordinary nights sitting on either side of it. It just happened to be the one loud enough to drown the rest out. She called him on her break 20 minutes later, sitting in the break room with a vending machine coffee going cold in front of her. You popped that lock in under 2 minutes. Airbag wedge and a long reach usually goes fast if the gap's clean, Dean said, and she could hear the careful, unsure note under the casual answer, like he wasn't certain yet what kind of call this actually was. You dispatched that one? I did, Holly said, and I sat here after logging it closed doing math I should have done 11 days ago. You run what, 40, 50 calls a week? How many of those look anything like the ice storm? Maybe one bad one a month, if that, Dean said. Most of it's exactly what you just heard. Locked keys, dead batteries, somebody's transmission giving out on the highway, shoulder in broad daylight. I let one call convince me the whole job was that call, Holly admitted, staring at the vending machine coffee without drinking it. That's not fair to you, and it's not accurate to what you actually do most nights. It's not an unreasonable thing to be scared of, Dean said, careful, not letting her off the hook entirely either. I'm not going to pretend Cody's leg was nothing, or that it couldn't happen again. I just don't get to stop doing the job because it's dangerous sometimes. Same as you don't get to stop taking calls because some of them are bad ones. I know that, Holly said. I think what scared me wasn't really the danger. It was finding out I cared enough about you that the danger actually mattered now. And I didn't know what to do with that yet. She turned the coffee cup slowly on the table, not quite ready to look up, even though he couldn't see her anyway. I don't want to keep managing you from behind a console and pretending that's the same as facing it. I want to actually see what the job looks like on your side of the radio, the boring parts included, so it stops living in my head as just the worst night. There was a pause on the line, and when Dean spoke again, his voice had lost the careful edge from a minute earlier. You want to ride along sometime? Slow night, nothing dramatic. Just see what 49 boring calls out of 50 actually look like. I'll need to add you to the insurance rider, but that's just paperwork. Yeah, Holly said, something loosening in her chest for the first time in 11 days. I do. She rode along the following Saturday, a slow, unremarkable night by Dean's own standards, sitting in the passenger seat of his primary truck while he ran 3 calls back to back. A dead battery on a minivan in a church parking lot, a flat tire change for a college kid stranded outside a gas station, a routine tow for an abandoned vehicle a state trooper had flagged on the shoulder of a 2-lane county road. Holly watched him work each one with the same unhurried competence she'd first noticed on the boat months earlier, chalking wheels before he touched a jack, checking his mirrors twice before stepping anywhere near live traffic. The kind of careful habits that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with a man who took the actual mechanics of staying safe as seriously as the mechanics of the job itself. On the flat tire change, he had the college kid stand well up on the shoulder behind the guardrail before he'd even pull the jack out. No exceptions. No rushing it because the kid was cold and impatient. And Holly watched him work the lug nuts loose in a star pattern the same unhurried way he'd once threaded a hook on the boat. Competence that looked almost boring from the outside, precisely because none of it was improvised. All of it practiced enough times that there was nothing left to react to, just a process he trusted to hold up the same way every time. Between calls, riding down a dark county road with the truck's heater running and the county radio murmuring low traffic from other units. Dean glanced over at her. This what you needed to see? This is exactly what I needed to see, Holly said, watching the yellow line of the road unspool in the headlights. You're careful, genuinely careful, not just lucky. I think I needed to actually watch that instead of just hearing about it after the fact. I'm not going to tell you nothing bad ever happens again, Dean said. That'd be a lie, and you'd know it was a lie. I don't need you to lie to me, Holly said. I need to keep doing this, riding along sometimes, seeing the boring nights so they outweigh the one bad one in my head, the way they actually do in real life. Dean reached over without making it into anything bigger than it was and unclipped the truck's spare county radio handset from its mount on the dash, setting it in the cup holder between them instead of back on its hook. Keep this close on the slow nights then. You'll hear the boring calls, same as the bad ones. Same channel I run everything on. 2 months later, on an unremarkable Thursday evening, with nothing more dramatic on the schedule than a dead battery call across town, Holly sat in the passenger seat of Dean's truck again. the spare county radio handset resting in the cup holder between them, exactly where he'd left it that first ride-along night, occasionally crackling to life with routine traffic from his other truck out on a call of its own. She wasn't riding along every shift, wasn't managing his fear or hers from behind a console anymore either, just showing up often enough that the boring nights had genuinely started to outnumber the bad one. In the running total she kept somewhere in the back of her mind, exactly the way real life actually worked when you stopped letting one loud night speak for all the quiet ones. Dean glanced over at a stoplight, caught her watching the handset instead of the road, and didn't say anything about it, just reached over and turned the volume down half a notch so the quiet, ordinary hum of an ordinary Thursday could fill the cab instead.